Hey guys, welcome to another video. So I'm from Salesforce Traders team, and in this session we're gonna create a basic Lightning form using our Aura component, and then we're gonna create an account record from the form and save it to our backend database. All right. So again, for any references to any code, you can go to our website salesforcetraders.com, go to the Salesforce Lightning section, and then go to create a basic Lightning form subtopic under it. Okay, so in our previous session, we created a component with a JavaScript controller and a server-side controller. And we were also able to call that server-side method from a JavaScript controller. So in this session, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new component. Let me do that. So again, we're going to click on File, New, and we're going to click on Lightning component, and let's name this component Basic Form Component CMP. All right, click on Submit, and we have this form ready. So the first thing that we want to do is, since we want to save an account record, we're going to create an Aura attribute of the type account. So what we're going to do is you can go to website and copy the code from there. I mean, this is just, we're just declaring Aura attribute of the name ACC, and this is of the type account. And in the default, you haven't put any default field values, you just put the object type account, right? Now we have our markup over here. So the markup is again pretty simple. We just have multiple div elements, and inside each we are just actually inputting certain fields that we need in order to save the account, which are the account name, account description, the account's year started field, and then we have a save button on the bottom. So now this is particularly all that you need on your markup side. This will give out a form to you. So now moving on, what we're going to do first is we're going to create a JavaScript controller, and then we have this save method, right, which is just save. So we want to define the save method in our JavaScript controller as well. So I'm gonna just rename this normal myActions JavaScript function with save and save it. So when now I click this save button, this will call my JavaScript function. Now, the next step that we want to do is we want to create an Apex class, which will house the logic to save our account to our backend database, and then link that Apex class to this Aura component. The same stuff that we did in our previous session. So go ahead, click on New Apex class, and we're going to call it Basic Form Controller. Click on OK, and we have our class ready. Then as to the actual method inside that class, it's going to be really simple. We're going to create an Aura enabled method called createAccount, which will accept an account object as a parameter. We are going to insert that account, and then this method is going to return us the account ID in the response, so that we can check if the account was created in our JavaScript controller. So now I'm going to link this Apex controller to my Lightning component by using the controller tag. And so now this is now linked to my Apex class. So in the previous session, we touched a little bit on the helper and event that. So the first part, the component is used to read and fetch values from our component markup, like reading attribute values and things like that. So in this particular example, we're going to use our helper. And the main purpose of this helper is that you can create some JavaScript code and put it in your helper file, and then reuse that file everywhere you want to use that. So in order to use this helper, the first thing you need to do is create the helper class for this component, which is done by going to this and clicking on the create link. And I'm gonna rename this as helper save and save this. So now what we're going to do is in our save JavaScript function, instead of writing all the logic here, we're going to write the logic to call the Apex class in our helper method right here. So what we just need to do in the JavaScript controller is call our helper method, which is this one right here. So you can call any helper method by using this third helper argument. Again, you can rename it to anything. It doesn't have to be helper every time, but we're gonna go with just helper for now. So the only thing you need to do here is helper dot and then copy your method name in your helper which you want to call and just save this. So now when I click on the save button right here, we'll call the JavaScript function save method, and then from this method we're going to call the helper save method. So now the next step is when we call this helper, we want to write the logic to call our backend class from this helper save function. But the one thing you'll notice is that by default, nothing is being passed in this helper save function. So in order to call your backend method, you need to get that method like we did in the previous example with this component. So we need to pass this component in our helper so that we can read all attribute values and the Apex method in our helper. So I pass in the component from here to the helper like this, and then we receive it here. Now again, you can rename the component to anything you want. So even though we are using component here, you can use CMP here. It doesn't matter. The only thing you need to make sure is if you're using component here, you pass in as component when you pass it to the helper, but inside the actual helper file, you can rename it to anything. So now we just take the code to call your backend here. And the way you do this is something like this. So in the example on our site, we haven't used a helper, but I am showing you guys how to call it with a helper as well. So since we're going to walk through this code a little bit, so let's go back to our Apex class. So our method's name is createAccount, right? So the first thing we do is we define an action variable, and then we link this action variable to our backend method called createAccount. Now, this second line action.setParams. So setParams is actually used to pass parameters to your Apex method. In our previous example, we were not passing anything to our Apex method, but in this scenario, we're passing this account ACC. So you can pass any parameters in this setParams function. And so what we're doing is we're passing it in the form of a JSON where ACC is the parameter name which is being passed, which is right here. You need to make sure that you have the exact same names in your Apex class and your helper or in your JavaScript, because if they are same and they are case sensitive, if you use different parameters name, your function calling is not going to work. So in this ACC, what we are doing is we are passing the ACC attribute that we defined in our component, this one. So whatever values you put into these input fields, that would be reflected into this ACC account attribute. And then we pass this account attribute into our backend by fetching it with component.get and then just passing it in the ACC parameter in our Apex class. Then the next thing is our callback method. So again, now there is one more scenario here of error handling. So what we mean by that is, let's say you send data to be saved as an account record in your backend, but for some reason you get an exception. Maybe you don't have a required field. Maybe some automation on that account is broken and it's not working and it's giving you an exception. So what you can do is you can use this response.getState function, And what this returns is if everything went fine, there was no exception, this state value is returned as success. So we just fetch the state value, and if we get the success state, we just alert out the record ID that we get back from our controller, which is right here. But if you get an exception, then the state value is returned as error, and then you can place a check here if an exception occurred. You can fetch all the errors that we got with response.getErrors. We do that and we put that in our variable errors, and then we just alert that out again. And we are doing json.stringify because this is returned in a JSON object format, and this is just for ease of readability for the user. And then lastly, the main line in queueAction, this is again what calls a backend method. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this. So now since we have everything set up, let me create a new application to preview this. I'm gonna go into application. We're gonna name it basic form component app. And just like all the other examples, I'm gonna put my component in here. And save this. So let me now just preview this. So you see we have all three fields and that simple button, that save button, right? So now this is all the way over here because we have not used CSS properly. So let me just fix that. Let me place the button on the left hand side with all the fields. Let me refresh this. All right, so our button is now ready. So let me name it as Salesforce Drillers. The description is going to be test description, and the date started is 2020. And now we're going to click on the save. So as you see, there was some exception which occurred. So what happened was our state was returned as error and we got the error message. So let us fix this and then retest. Okay, so that exception was actually due to a trigger breaking in our org, and I fixed that. That is not part of the scope of this session, so we're going to not go too much into that, but let's again try. I'm going to again put Salesforce Drillers in here. The description is test description. And again, the year is 2020. And let us click on the save button. So, all right, now since we disabled that trigger, we see ID for our account record. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open this up in our org right here. So as you guys can see, the account record was created with the name Salesforce Drillers. The description was test description. So right now, this is all working fine. But let's again try an error scenario. So since we have not placed any required field checks on the form itself, let's see what happens if I don't provide the name field to the account, which is like a standard required field. So I'm gonna just put the description. I mean, this is to test DSC, and account year started is 2010. We'll click on the save. So you can see we got the error that one of the required fields was missing, and it also gave me the message that the required field missing is the account name. So this is really basic error handling. You guys can like perfect it out based on whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter. But this is how basically this works. You can call any backend method like this. You can do exception handling on the JavaScript side and then just alert it out to a user. But let's look at the example. If we want to do exception handling on the Apex side itself, we don't want the error message or error exception handling to be happening in our JavaScript side right here. So the one way you can achieve this is instead of using just an ID parameter, I mean, not really that, but what you can do is place a try catch here. And instead of using a ID parameter, what you're going to do is we're going to define a wrapper class here. And let's say aura response. And the way we're going to do is we're going to define two variables in this class. Both of these need to be aura enabled. So let's say one of them is a Boolean. All right. And then the second is your string variable called message. And then we also define a constructor for this wrapper class just to initialize everything. And what we can do is we can do the success as true by default and the message as blank. So now instead of returning the ID, we're going to return this aura response from our Apex class. And the reason it's a good idea to do this is what you are going to do here is you're going to put your insertion DML in try catch. And then in the first line of our method, we are going to define an instance of this aura response. Let's call it RESP equal to new aura response. And now if everything goes fine, the account is inserted. Then after the try catch, or even inside the try catch, what you do is you do response dot message equals to account dot ID. And then in case if you get any exception, you do two things. You do response dot success equals to false, and then response dot message equal to e dot get message, which is like the standard syntax to get the exception message, right? And now I save this. So now how we streamline the error handling in that case is we're going to go back to our JavaScript, right? So right now what was going on was we were just printing out the ID or the response, which was getting returned to us directly. But now what we'll do is we're not going to alert it out directly. We're going to have proper error handling in here. So we're going to declare a variable called result, and we're going to store the response returned to us from our Apex class. So now the thing is the response being returned to us will be returned in the format of this wrapper class, and it will have like a success and a message variable. So what you can do is you can put an if here that if result dot success equals to true, then everything went fine. And then we alert out the account ID. All right, and then we do it by doing result dot message. And this message is this variable right here. And if the result is not true, if we got any error, you can do alert, and let's say they say it as error, and then again we're gonna just use result.message, since even in the case of an exception we're setting the error message in this message attribute. So let us go back to our form. Let's say we do again another test. Salesforce is fine. We're gonna Description is test. We're going to leave the year started as blank. We save this, so you see everything was saved fine. So we got this account ID. So again, we go back to our org, check if this account ID points to the correct account record, and yeah, you can see the account record is created again. Now, if I go back to my component and let's say we again refresh this, we don't supply the name, we just supply the description and we click on save. So in this case, you see this error message is now printed, the error one, and this is like in a more readable form to the user. So this makes sure that every exception handling is being handled in your Apex itself, and you just need to use a wrapper class to properly assess if it was a success or not, and then print it accordingly here. All right, so it's pretty easy stuff. In the next session, we're going to talk a little bit more detail about proper error handling, showing pop-up messages, and how to reuse your helper methods, and what are more advanced scenarios of using your helper methods. All right. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you guys understood everything and keep supporting our website.